That starts now. So welcome to the Careers in Political Risk, Conflict and Security panel for 2021. So we're very lucky today to be joined by four panelists, all of whom have studied at LSE previously. We've got them, I think, in 3 countries and 2 different continents at the moment, so a very international affair. So as you can see from the screen at the moment, we're joined by James Barker. So James is a Senior Director at Kroll in the Business Intelligence and Investigations practice based in Boston in the US since 2019 after previously being in London. Specializes in complex cross-border and technology-assisted investigations. He's conducted and managed government corruption inquiries, money laundering investigations, fraud investigations, many other things as well. In 2019, he presented at the World Bank on exposing corruption through open source investigations. And he holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in International History from the LSE. We're also joined by Sophia. So Sophia is an associate at Walbrook, where her focus is on Southern Europe and Francophone Africa. As an Italian, French and Spanish speaker, she has completed many investigations in a range of sectors and jurisdictions, and before joining Walbrook, spent 3 years at another London-based business intelligence firm, gaining experience in due diligence, asset tracing, litigation support work. Has also got experience in private equity and holds a master's degree in international relations from LSE. We're also joined by Isma. So Isma is a junior professional officer at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So she is a graduate of the MSc in Comparative Politics. After graduating from LSE, went on to pursue a career in various international organizations and NGOs with a focus on international security, peace and conflict, counterterrorism and prevention of violent extremism. In addition to that, she has worked as a policy assistant for the UNDP and a project development and grant specialist for different NGOs in Africa, focusing on the protection of refugees and other vulnerable groups in the context of sectarian conflict. There's plenty more I can read. They'll all be doing their own introductions as well in a second. And last, but only by alphabetical preference, Sarah. So Sarah is a senior security analyst at World Vision International. She joined World Vision in 2014, working for the UK office as the senior conflict advisor for 6.5 years before transitioning to World Vision International earlier this year to work for the security team. In her current role, she is responsible for shaping the organization's understanding of complex, fragile and conflict-affected contexts, building field security capacity through coaching and mentoring, amplifying voices from the field and ensuring consistent, high-quality security risk analysis to decision makers in the organization. And just looking down here, also holds her degree is a BA in International History from the LSE. She's also a deployable civilian expert with the UK Government Stabilisation Unit, an associate lecturer at Oxford Brookes for their MA in Humanitarian Action and Peace Building, and is on board of trustees for a small Kenyan education charity. So that's enough from me, and the bios are all on the events page on Career Hub if you'd like to look at them in more detail. What we're going to do is now enable each of the panelists to give their introductions, and when it comes to the last introduction, please do start using the chat function to ask questions to our panel. So please put your questions in to the chat, and if it's for a particular panelist, please make it clear. If it's for all panelists, please make it clear as well. And myself and my colleague John will be facilitating the chat and the questions and putting them to the panel on your behalf. Okay, so with that, I'm now going to put James. You're coming up first in the spotlight, so if you're ready, please take the floor.
Thanks, Barnaby. Hi, everyone. I was just remembering when we started this that I did do this in person a few years ago. And as it happens, one of the people who attended that talk is now, I won't name them because they're still being interviewed, is being interviewed for a position here in the Boston team. So she said to me, oh, and I came to that panel. I was like, excuse me, what do you mean panel? She's like, at LSE. And I was like, oh. So it's obviously, it's a worthwhile thing from my perspective to do, because I never know when, when it might come round again. So last time, I was thinking back to what I said last time. I gave a sort of an overview of how I left LSE and how I ended up where I am. I'm going to do the same, but along the way, I'll try and mention a couple of interesting cases and projects that we've done. So I graduated from LSE in 2010. I meant it's relevant that it was 2010, I think, because a lot of you are facing a similar situation to what we faced in 2010 when the job market is weird and the economy is a bit weird. That was coming out of the financial crisis, and there was jobs still in the city, but they were getting less, and the types of jobs elsewhere were very competitive. And I remember having to sort of just think about what actually I wanted at that point in time, and all I wanted so I was quite young going into LSE. I was just undergrad, went straight from school. I was 21 and I was like, okay, so what do I want from life as a 21-year-old? And the only thing I could decide at that time was to stay in London. So I stayed in London and I worked at the Apple Store on Regent Street. I'm sure some of you have been to that Apple Store. And I loved it. I worked there for about a year. And it was very good for someone like me who hadn't had a proper job before, who hadn't had to get up on time and go to a job and do proper things, which, you know, I'm sure many of you have, many of you aren't as pathetic as I was at that age, but it was very good for me. It taught me how to sell. It taught me to, you know, get there on time. It taught me to sort of talk with customers, and ultimately I've used some of those skills that I was taught at the Apple Store to talk to clients now. So I think that's always worth mentioning, that it wasn't obvious at the start that I would have ended up doing what I was doing straight out of LSE. So I think people need to perhaps take a breath. If you haven't found the perfect thing yet, take a breath, maybe work at the Apple Store. There are worse things to do. So then I messed around with the idea that I wanted to be in advertising. I think at the time I was watching a lot of Mad Men, and I thought I just want to be a toxic man like Don Draper in advertising. I'm glad I didn't go down that path in retrospect, but you know, I was watching a lot of Mad Men and I was a 21-year-old guy, and that's what I thought I wanted to do. It didn't work out. I got through the last round of a graduate recruitment program, and it wasn't to be. And then I heard about this industry, and the way I heard about it, to be very straightforward with you, is that my dad was he worked for a small engineering company up in Cambridge, and they needed a bit of business intelligence done, and they'd used Kroll. So he was like, oh, there's my useless 21-year-old son who doesn't know what he wants. I'm going to introduce him to the guy who just did some work for me at Kroll. So that's how I got him, which is one of the reasons why I love to do these events, because that's the way I found out it existed. And many people don't have that, you know, don't have their dad like buying the services. So that's why I come to these things and tell everyone about the industry exists. So it isn't just a bunch of people like me working in the industry. And from there, I did an internship at Kroll. They were really unsure about me initially. I think I was still quite fresh out of university, and I got in trouble with one of their clients. I'm giving you the truth. And they extended my internship for another 3 months. But then by that time, I was able to impress them enough to stay on and become an analyst. And I worked in London all in all about 8 years, progressing up through the firm. So what does Kroll do in the last sort of few minutes? Kroll is an investigations and intelligence firm. It works for clients all over the world. It's the biggest, and I hope the other people in the panel won't mind me saying, it's certainly the most well known in the industry. It was the founder sort of kind of invented the corporate intelligence industry, where essentially companies and private individuals need intelligence, and they also need help with investigations. And it was set up in New York, and it's had a London presence for most of the time it's been in existence. It is now all over the world. And broadly, when I'm in an elevator pitch or I'm trying to explain what Kroll does, I say, think of it like this. So Kroll, broadly, I'll explain later how it's the Kroll name has expanded a little bit since its original conception, but its original conception was it's to help clients get information to stop bad things happening. So before you go into a deal, before you go into an agreement, so you want to invest in a certain country or invest in a certain industry or invest with certain people, Kroll will help provide the intelligence so you can make a more sophisticated decision. That's due diligence. And then on the other side, you've got the investigations when things go wrong. So that can be if there's a cyber attack. That's not the part of the business I work in, but we have a part of the business that does that. Or it could be there's been a fraud, or there's been some corruption, or there's someone has been manipulating your share price, or a whole gamut of problems, or really it ranges from sort of low-level fraud through to occasionally there's even been murder cases that Kroll's famously been involved with. So it's sort of that is broadly what I do at Kroll. I'm much more on the investigation side. And about a year and a half ago, I moved to our Boston office. I moved to our Boston office in particular because my wife is doing, and be familiar to some of you, doing a public policy degree at Harvard. And I was able at that point, after 8 years of working for Kroll, to ask for an internal intercompany transfer. And that was one of the benefits, and we can talk about that, of the fact I'd worked for one place for a long time. I had a lot of capital, sort of internal political capital, that I could then spend when I needed to move. I know nowadays people change jobs quite a lot, but sometimes there's a benefit to staying in one place and sometimes there's not. In my case, there was a benefit, and I was able to follow my wife, or then fiance, now wife, to Cambridge, Massachusetts. So overall, I think Kroll's been a great, fascinating place to work. I've done all sorts of investigations. I'm happy to talk about many of those as the panel goes on a no-names basis. And I think I'll stop there, Barnaby, as an introduction. So I'll go below 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. I was literally about to message you. You've done very well on timing.
Hold on. Yep. You heard me.
The timing is good. That's perfect. Thank you very much for that, James. We're now going to go to
switch my headphones.
Sophia next.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophia. I am a senior associate at Walbrook, which is another company in the same sector that James was just discussing there. I was actually laughing to myself as you were describing your sort of trajectory from LSE to getting into this sector, because it's remarkably similar to the sort of path that I took. And then sort of halfway through, I was like, actually, he's stealing all my material for my speech next. So I'm probably gonna have to wing it a bit to not cover too much of the same ground twice, but there we go. So yes, leaving LSE, I studied at LSE. I did a history of international relations degree for my master's. I graduated in 2015 and left completely clueless with what I was going to do next. And that really shows on my CV. I sort of jumped around. I started off working in an NGO and then took the natural progression into a private equity fund. Neither was really the right fit. And I suppose I would echo what James was saying is to kind of encourage you not to sort of feel too put out if you haven't got it all figured out from day one. Because even though I didn't necessarily find my ideal job straight out the gates, I kind of discovered a lot about what it was that I really liked. And when I sort of stumbled into business intelligence, it really hit all those right notes for me. And in terms of sort of what it was that I sort of figured out that I wanted to do, or that I wanted to pursue, or I was interested in, I suppose from working with this NGO for a bit, as I did after I left LSE, I kind of developed a taste for doing research work. I really enjoyed doing research. I really enjoyed the subject matter we were looking at. We were doing a sort of gemstone supply chain project in Afghanistan. It was really exciting, but I found that it was, for me, maybe slightly lacking in a commercial aspect. I felt perhaps there wasn't really quite enough structure. And so then I sort of jumped to the other side of the spectrum and went into private equity. And I loved that commercial aspect, really exciting, working on deals, sort of quite high pressure, but sort of, quite exciting. I also was oddly working in an office with only Italian and Spanish. So I was speaking in Italian and Spanish all the time, and I love that. So I really want to continue doing something where I'm going to be using my languages all the time. But for me, with private equity, the game changer ended up being the maths. I could not get it. I can barely count past my fingers. There was a disaster. They were super patient, but eventually I was like, basta, let's try something else. And so, again, similarly to James, I was introduced to the sectors slightly by chance, slightly by an exasperated parent saying, go and speak to so-and-so. I'm sure they'll be able to find a proper job for you. Stop messing about. And I don't know if the moral of the story here is always listen to your parents, because I'm very glad that I did decide to go for that coffee and take that internship and eventually end up working for the first company I worked for in the sector, which is called Alico, because I found a sector that was really kind of hit all the right notes for me, and that I find is a really good fit. And I guess to kind of explore a bit why it happened to be such a good fit for me, it would be helpful to kind of give a bit of an overview. I think James already gave quite a good overview of the sector, that sort of diligence aspect, pre-transactional, making sure bad things don't happen, and the investigation side, which is sort of more after the fact, maybe more targeted, a bit more problem solving based. But if you kind of take a step back even further and you say, okay, why are our clients hiring us to do that? What is the skill set that we need to have in order to make us successful in that industry, in order to make people want to part with their money to have us do these jobs for them? And for me, it boils down to a number of things, all of which I really love and get really excited about. Number one, I think, is regional expertise, and language skills are a sort of addendum to that. I think that in order to be really good at this job, you kind of have to have an interest. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be in one region, could be several, but I guess just in kind of understanding how different societies work, how the politics influences the way that people do business, and to have a kind of a hunger for knowledge to kind of understand how a different market ecosystem works somewhere else, because that's always going to be a really central aspect of the research that we're doing. I think secondly, you've got to enjoy the investigation. Like, you want to be one of those people who really wants to always pursue an investigation to it the furthest degree possible, kind of leave no stone unturned, and that you kind of like get your kicks out of it a bit, which again, I love. Third of all, I think that analysis is a huge part of that. Maybe that's a bit of a generic word, but I think that, you know, what makes us different from Google is that we don't just fetch information, we fetch it, we digest it, we pull out the bits that are important, and we present it in a way that's going to kind of tell a story or spin a certain argument. And finally, I think intelligence is another really important aspect of what we do. Not necessarily intelligence like that. I think more sort of, actually almost the opposite. I think that a really good investigator always sort of knows their limitations and knows when they have to kind of defer to somebody else who's more of an expert. And I think that cultivating a really good network of expert sources, people who are sort of authoritative voices on certain sectors or companies or individuals, that's again a really big part of what we do. And working with those people is something that I at least find sort of really exciting and engaging, I guess. I think I'm kind of like nearly running out of time, but I'll quickly whiz through my last couple of things. But wave at me, Barnaby, if I'm banging on. I think sort of aside from the research aspects of the job, I think it's also important to remember that, you know, business intelligence is ultimately a really commercially driven sector. This is not kind of abstract or theoretical research that we're doing. You're working on live deals, you're solving real problems for your clients, and you're influencing their decision making. I think that if you're doing it right, each project should be different. It should be always sort of tailored to the specific needs of that client. And you're looking less for sort of cookie cutter projects and more for sort of real problem solving, which I think is very exciting. I think I'm probably nearly done. I guess just to kind of wrap up, I think that, you know, there's a lot of different specialities across the industry. Businesses will always sort of specialize in different areas. I know that, you know, there's a sort of cyber element to the sector, there's security element to the sector. I think that one element that's becoming increasingly exciting and important is ESG. which I know is a term that's bandied around a lot, and it's something that we at Walbrook are really trying to get ahead of. And yeah, I'll be happy to, if anyone's interested, to answer more questions on that during the question session, but I will leave it there for now.
Thanks, Sophia. That's great. So Isma, you're up next.
Yeah, hi everyone. So thanks Barnaby for giving me the floor, and thanks to the panelists we had before for very interesting presentations. And my name is Isma Lamurja. You can call me Isma, shorter, easier. And I'm here, I have to say first of all that I'm here under my personal LSE graduate capacity, and that anything I say does not reflect the views of my organization and the 57 participating states. So I graduated from the LSE with a Master of Science in Comparative Politics in 2016. And since then, I started a career in the international organizations, regional organizations, EU institutions. So I've always been working quite like on the other side, more on like in public, let's say. And so I started with internships in the United Nations system. After graduating from the LSE, I flew to New York for an internship in the United Nations Secretariat, where I started working on counterterrorism, prevention of violent extremism. That later became a little bit of my expertise, let's say. So at the time I was working at the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, working on capacity building programs, mainly focusing on the region of the Sahel of Africa, and programs that were also addressing, for instance, human rights and counterterrorism and prevention of violent extremism, a lot of different aspects of the topic. And afterwards, I went to Brussels and I was a Blue Book trainee for the European Commission, working on a slightly different topic, because I was working on the connection in between taxation, fraud, and transnational organized crime. But my position as a Blue Book trainee was very varied. I remember I was also doing communications. I was doing a lot of work around Brexit, because that was the time that things were starting to get clear about what was coming for the UK. And afterwards, I did a third internship. I went to the field in Kosovo for the organization I work for now, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Our secretariat is based in Vienna, but we have field missions in different locations. So my first experience with them was an internship in Kosovo. And I was mainly doing security sector reform and capacity building programs for the Kosovo police forces, Kosovo security forces, and with a focus on special forces dealing with terrorism and specific crimes. It was very interesting. We were doing quite a lot of capacity building with them. Especially it was interesting for me because it was my first time doing field work in a post-conflict environment. And it was very exciting because I was actually not based in the capital entirely, but I was working every day in a police academy in the north of Kosovo. So that was a really interesting experience for me. And afterwards, I went on and I became a policy assistant for the UNDP, where I was doing policy review of major programs of the United Nations Development Program, including programs that were involving refugees and internally displaced persons in volunteering and resilience. And afterwards, the lockdown came, so there was this whole Corona situation, and I was in Italy, actually under lockdown for the first wave, and that's where I consulted with two different NGOs based in Africa. I was remotely based, of course, and one NGO was in Sierra Leone, and I was a team leader leading a project team of 5 people. And I was leading the team in the project development and grants applications in a wide range of programs and projects dealing mainly with water and sanitation, education. So something really different from the security and really focused on security and conflict that I've been doing before. So with this NGO, I was doing more like education, sanitation, and this kind of stuff. And then I was also consulting for a second NGO in Cameroon, which was working with internally displaced persons and refugees in the north area of the country, where there is a sectarian conflict called the Anglophone crisis. And afterwards, I came to the position that I have now. I'm a junior professional officer. I'm sure many of you already know about the program. That is a program to enter the major international organizations sponsored by your home country. In my case, I'm sponsored by the Foreign Ministry of Italy, and I'm placed in the OSCE Secretariat in Vienna. And what do I do here? I work in a unit which is called Action Against Terrorism. So I do quite a lot of project and program management, and I have two main portfolios. One is countering the use of the internet for terrorist purposes. So it can be anything from cyber attacks to the use of the internet for propaganda. And the second portfolio that I'm involved in is the protection of vulnerable targets from terrorist attacks. It can be anything from energy infrastructure to tourism infrastructure, places of worship, and how to protect them from terrorist threats. So this is pretty much what I've been doing after LSE. And to go back a little bit, like what would be useful to go after a career in my sector. I'm sure there will be more questions afterwards about that. I would say that one of the main characteristics is perseverance and resilience. I don't even remember how many applications I sent out, especially when I was graduating from the LSE, and I had an idea that I wanted to go for international organizations, the UN system, but it was all very blurry. So don't give up, even if you have to send hundreds of applications. Maybe the last one is going to be your successful one, and this is happening, for instance, my UN internship. The last application that I sent got me in. So, and the second thing is, I would say that skills that are very much valued are, for instance, project and program management. A lot of work that we do is project and program management, capacity building, the creation of tailored programs. It can be for different stakeholders, for member states, for security forces, for other organizations. So that's something that could definitely put a foot into the door. And connecting back to resilience as well is the fact that for instance, in my sector, it's very foreseeable to be unemployed for some periods of time and to have to change very often work and location. Like, it's my 5th year doing this job, and I've already lived in 6 different countries and 6 different cities. So that's something. Sometimes it's exciting, sometimes it's stressful, but that's part of the game. And that entails as well different periods in which you can be unemployed for a long time. And it's not just you. I mean, because sometimes you can think, oh, maybe it's me. There is something that is not going well, but it's actually everyone. So these are some advices that I would give you to someone who wants to get into my sector. And as other speakers were saying, don't worry too much if you don't know where you want to be in 5 years and 10 years now that you're graduating. I also had no idea how my life would go and that it would develop like this. Of course, as I said, I had an idea, but everything comes into shape with time and with experiences. So be open and be flexible with that. Absolutely. And I think that's all for me, and I'm sure there will be more time during the questions.
Thank you very much, Esma. That's great. Sarah, by no means least but last today, do you want to come in?
Sure. Thanks, Barnaby. And thanks to the rest of the panel. And hi, everybody. It's great to be with you. So yeah, I maybe come at this from a slightly different angle because I currently work for an NGO. And those of you who don't know World Vision, it's sort of what we would say a multi-mandated NGO in that it straddles across working in relief, humanitarian environments, and then into the longer term development and advocacy and peace building. And so you might then think, well, what's an NGO doing in this kind of panel? But it's because I think the face of poverty in terms of NGOs as we respond, it is now very much that so many people are living in countries affected by conflict, fragility, violence. And NGOs, I think, are changing their strategies, a lot of them, and working more in those kind of environments. And so if you're going to work in those environments, we have to grapple with the complexity of these issues, the security risks. We have to do analysis. We have to look at how we can have safe and effective programming that keeps our staff safe, that doesn't put our beneficiaries in harm's way, that makes sure that we understand the context of actually our interventions when we go into places don't actually become part of the problem and cause harm. So this is why I actually sit in a security team in World Vision, in the NGO that I work for, in terms of doing analysis for them. And that can be country specific, that can be thematic, But I've also worked in my UK role before I joined my current role at the moment, again, doing analysis of countries and contexts, because that's important to inform what we do, but then also as contexts change, that we need to adapt with them and we need to be flexible. And often in conflict-affected areas, that happens very frequently. So I guess if that's the kind of my role as it currently looks, how did I kind of get to this? As Barnaby was sort of mentioning, I was an LSE graduate, and then after I did my undergraduate, I went straight into my master's across the road at King's. And I think I'd always cultivated a particular interest in conflict and fragility. And as other panelists have said, it's great to have that focus, but don't expect that your career will always then follow that. So I moved around in the NGO sector because I wanted to work in areas of conflict and fragility, but I also had to be quite pragmatic and look for internships that would work in terms of what was available, networking, connecting with people. And so I got an internship, ironically, with my current employer, but that internship didn't lead to a job afterwards. And that's maybe something to kind of share from my experience. Don't expect internships that they will potentially lead to jobs, but they're great for building up that experience, which eventually will probably count for a lot more than studies when you get into further down into your career. And then so after my internship, that gave me enough into my entry-level position into an NGO. And I actually started my career doing advocacy and lobbying and sort of influencing what that was the UK government, MPs on particular issues, starting with thematic on malaria, moving then to country specific with my next charity, Tear Fund on Congo and South Sudan. So I started to get a bit of taste for working on conflict, and then moving finally into World Vision, where I started to have a job that was solely focused on conflict and fragility, but had a technical aspect to it in terms of analysis and supporting our offices in the programs where we were working, as well as doing advocacy in the UK. So yeah, I've had a very interesting path. And I think the thing with the NGO sector is always to say there isn't a set path, and it's never a case of A plus B and then C, and then you'll get there. So people have said lots of things around persevering, keeping a focus in terms of what you're interested in, but being prepared to get involved in lots of things because you're building a skill set, and that can transfer across. And the NGO world is no different to a lot of others in that it needs all kinds of skills. It needs accountants and engineers and program managers and researchers. So figuring out the skill sets that you're good at, having a particular focus of knowledge or area or region, as some have said, or an expertise that you really are interested in, cultivating that so that you can show when you do find a job maybe that you want to join into, that you're interested. That really speaks a lot. And then I think I would just also encourage you really network with people, connect with people, go to events, chat with people, connect with them on LinkedIn, ask questions, because a lot of my internships and jobs were, as others were saying, that other people pointed them out, other people pointed me in the right direction. And it's therefore a very relational sector, the NGO sector. And so it's great that you can connect with people and you never know what opportunities might come from that. So I think just use your time wisely as well as the final point. Experience is ultimately, again, going to become the gold dust. So in your spare time, your holidays, the extracurricular activities, try and cultivate that towards what you're interested to build up the kind of experience that you would want to then hopefully sell to your future employer in terms of hopefully why they should go with you in terms of the role. But I think I would just end to say that it's a fantastic sector to work in, the NGO sector. It's really varied, it's very interesting, and particularly I think it's up in terms of areas and jobs in security and conflict. That is very much now a growing area in NGOs. And there are a variety of different roles that people can look to and get involved in. But it's just so brilliant, I think, to work for charities where they are obviously trying to make a real difference in the lives of some of these people living in really difficult places. So yeah, happy to take any questions and expand on any of these points later. Thanks, Barnaby.
Thank you, Sarah. That's great. So that concludes the introductions from everyone and a real insight, I think, already into the sorts of work that everyone is doing. I'm going to now start with the questions. So both myself and John will go through these and alternate. A lot of questions have already come in, so we're working our way through them and combining any similar questions on themes. So if you don't hear a question being asked directly, we may have combined it with a different question as well. The first one is for all of the panel. First of all, thanks you for your insightful introductions. This is from Puvika. She says, as a second-year undergraduate studying international relations and Spanish, I've been looking for internships and work experience within sort of the sector broadly, but there aren't that many opportunities for undergraduates in this field. I was wondering what you think I should do and could do to get relevant work experience at this stage, or to build towards doing that. I'm going to start back with James for that one, because it's been a while since we had you on the mic.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. So in terms of experience, it depends on what, if you're talking entry level, we certainly recruit people who have no prior experience of the industry. And I'm increasingly involved in that recruitment program. I'm going through a process here in Boston actually at the moment. So if anyone's based in Boston and wants to apply, you're welcome to. That we're looking for people who are inquisitive. I look for a strong academic background, but that doesn't mean, I mean, obviously LSE would go top of the list every time. So that's evident you have a strong academic background, because I want people who are able to deal with complexity. But also, I also like to look for, this is just a personal preference, but I think it's shared by a few of my colleagues. I like to look for the candidates to have done something else outside of the industry. I look for people who've had jobs, normal sort of looking jobs as well, and maybe have done, had to actually work day to day in a big organization. That's useful to me, because there's a little bit, when people come straight out of university, there's a little bit of, you always have to sort of, what's the right phrase? People have to get used to a working environment. It's different from, it's very different from an academic environment. So that's one of the things that I look for. That all said, there are quite a lot of internships around the industry that, that I'm in, that we're all in, because there is a lot of work that needs to be done that is not necessarily very complex, that just needs to be done quickly. And it needs to be done efficiently. It needs to be done at sort of internship level rates. So actually, there's quite a lot of demand, I think, for quite almost quasi full-time positions as interns, paid positions as interns. If you look around, I know we have some currently on our London website. So, or maybe they're not internships, but that kind of thing. So they're out there, but also entry level, I'm looking for slightly different things. I don't necessarily need any experience in the industry at all when I recruit.
Thanks, James. I'll put it next to Sophia, if you want to add anything to this.
No, I mean, I think I would sort of echo what James said. I don't think that there's, I think there's definitely a sort of requirement for having prior experience in the sector. I think that, a lot of entry level jobs are people coming straight out of university. And what's really important, I think, is to kind of have to be really interested in your subject, to be interested in your region. I think that language skills help a lot. And kind of, having that sort of inquisitive mindset, I think would be kind of the characteristics that we would look for.
Perfect, thank you. Isma, you've taken a different route and into a different sort of whole area really of the sector. Do you want to talk about your experience and what you'd think?
Well, I think that in the case of international organizations, it really depends on the program and sometimes on the requirements of different offices. Like for internships that I did in New York, in the UN, they required a master's degree. For the internship that I did in Kosovo in the OSCE, they required 2 years of experience already. So sometimes it gets really hard for undergrads. But I know as well of some people who are undergrads, and in different locations, they managed to get internships with UNDP, even at the undergraduate level. So that really depended on the fact that they were focusing on a certain region, a certain country, and then they were the perfect match, even during their undergraduate studies. So if you really have a specialization of something specific, then there might come something up for you, even if you're just an undergraduate.
Perfect, that's great. And Sarah, it's difficult to go to the last on this sort of question, and you touched on it a bit in your introduction anyway, but is there anything you'd kind of add as a good starting point for someone, I guess, as an undergraduate currently to get into your line of work?
I think, I mean, yeah, there are the internships that get advertised, that where some charities may have graduate schemes and may have the opportunity where, you know, that's on the website. But I know that they are massively fought over. Even the entry-level jobs. I think my organisation just put out one recently for an entry-level job and got, I think, 70 applicants trying for it. So it is tough, it is competitive. But I think that's where I would come back to my original point around networking, because a lot of actually sometimes internships in the charity sector evolve by who you know, as in if you end up getting to know people who happen to be working on a project, they may be able to actually create a way for you to get involved and get the experience. So actually half of the interns that I've worked with and actually my colleagues have worked with was actually because we'd met them, they were interested, they proved that they were capable in terms of, you know, writing an analysis and were willing to get involved. And therefore we connected and said, well, we actually have this project we're working on, let's create something and you can help us. It wasn't that we'd advertised it, it was actually just that they had networked with us and we knew them. So again, I would come back to saying it's about networking, because then people, you might be the first to know about an opportunity, or if someone's deciding, well, you know, we're thinking about taking one, rather than advertise it, well, actually, we know X person over here, you might as well just come and do it for us. So I know that maybe sounds unfair because it's very relational, but that's why I think you have to get out there and network.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to pass the baton to my colleague John to ask the next question.
Yeah, thank you, Barnaby. Yeah, there's some great questions coming in, so keep putting them in. So I had a question here. Interesting that a number of the speakers sort of spoke about the different journeys that they went on after their time at LSE. So we had a question from Tanya, who said, thank you very much for your insights. Would you say it is better to work and develop niche expertise in terms of the sectors or geography before exploring political risk jobs? So I'm not sure if it's better to go back to the start again and sort of touch and put this to James, and then we can go through again. Yeah, James.
I'm going to sort of just sort of draw a slight distinction between some of the things I've been hearing Sophia saying and what I've saying. I think very, you know, nothing big, but what I don't do is political risk, and Kroll doesn't do political risk. So I'm not the right person to ask about political risk in general. Obviously, I know what it is. It's very close to what we do, but it's not. So when I think Sophia was talking about language expertise, regional expertise, that's totally relevant to the types of things that Sophia's doing, but it's less relevant to the types of things that I do, which is more on the investigation side, where what I'm looking for is more an inquisitive mind and someone who's going to be able to learn how to be a good investigator. So I think there is a little distinction. Kroll does have some more regional roles. It's just not part of the, where, you know, more language specific, more regional specific stuff. It's just not the team that I'm in. We're much more the sort of complex problem solver consultancy part of the business. We're less sort of, you know, we're the specialists in this particular region part of the business. So the answer from me is that you don't need it. You don't even need language skills, although of course they're a sign of a well-rounded person often. But I wouldn't not hire someone because they didn't speak 4 languages. You know, I live with someone who speaks 5 languages. It's an amazing skill. I don't have it, but it's not necessary to be a good investigator to speak lots of languages. It is occasionally useful, though, if that makes sense.
Yes, thanks, James. That's yeah, definitely interesting to yeah, clarify that, I think. So Sarah, did you have any thoughts on this? Is it better to kind of specialize when it comes to the like the sectors, geography, or I suppose kind of having a broad range of expertise? Yeah, do you have any thoughts?
I guess that kind of depends on the type of role in the organisation, because, for example, if you were going into project management in NGOs, then actually that's a skill set that you can then argue that transfers across irrespective of the sector. And similar, because I had a career in influencing and advocacy, and I therefore was able to argue each of my jobs in the interview on a skill set basis, and then I learned the thematic. But so I think it really kind of depends, because also we have technical specialists in our NGOs on water and sanitation or child protection or livelihoods, and they have specifically honed their skills for that particular expertise. So there's both routes. I mean, I obviously, it's interesting because I say I honed my skills in advocacy, and then moved around thematically, but I always kept in my heart an interest in conflict, and eventually I've been able to build that up as a specialism as well. So, I mean, I think it kind of is both. You don't ever probably want to shut the door in either. You always want to try and be flexible, because sometimes it's what jobs are out there, and you need to kind of, in terms of build up that experience. But I think I would just say it's kind of good to be both, but just being aware that when you go down one particular route in the NGOs, sometimes it can typecast you. So actually then trying to break, when I did the advocacy influencing route and I then wanted to start moving into technical, I had to make quite a convincing case in my interview, because I was coming not with so much experience in that, and they were taking a bit of a chance on me because I'd had just one type of job. So actually, if I varied it a bit more, that might have stood me in a bit better stead. But I mean, they took a chance in it and it worked out well. But yeah, so I think it really kind of depends on what you're interested in.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Going to test the relay skills here. Barnaby, have you got a question ready to go?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to ask them. So I've got a couple of questions for different panelists. So the first one's going to go to both James and Sophia. So Sophia, I'll come to you first on this. So because you're both working in the sort of this similar sector, not quite the same, could you give an example of like a memorable investigation or piece of work that you've conducted, obviously within the realms of confidentiality and obscuring any details that you can't say on a recording, just to get an idea of the sort of cases and what they actually look like. So Sophia, could you start with that one? Is that all right?
Good. Yeah. I had one case actually, which I did recently, which was a really interesting case, and kind of jumped to the front of my mind. And I guess it's kind of a good example of perhaps some of the issues that you often have to grapple with these kind of projects, and how to present information, etc. So this subject was looking at an individual who obviously I can't name, who was involved during the 1990s in this massive corruption scandal in Italy called the Clean Hands investigation. And this was a sort of, this scandal really rocked Italy to its core. I mean, it's sort of pretty much all political parties had to be sort of disassembled and reassembled. There was this huge revelation about a massive network of corruption between all the big business families in Italy and all the major political parties. And it was really this sort of watershed moment for the country. And this individual was involved in that scandal, which obviously presented a big and quite thorny issue for us to grapple with. But actually, interestingly, what we sort of pulled out of really going in depth into sort of his role in the scandal, his role in Italy before, what he's done since, like where has he gone with his career since then, we sort of managed to come to the conclusion that in fact, if you were a sort of prominent business person at the time in Italy, you were not coming out of that scandal unscathed. And so we sort of, rather than perhaps sort of over sensationalizing and focusing on this one issue, we had to kind of situate it in the context of that country, of that time, of what was going on. And then we actually managed off the back of that to kind of come up with quite a sort of positive, in a way, presentation of what this individual had done since then. And I think that, that kind of sticks in my mind because A, it's fascinating and sort of covers a period of Italian history, which I think is really interesting. And B, it kind of goes to show that having an interest in the sort of history and politics of a country can really inform the view that you take on these sort of business related projects, essentially.
Thank you very much. And James.
I love cases like that where you the guy's bad, but you put it in context for the client and you help the client understand the context about it. I think that's a really good example of it. When I talk about my work, there's sort of stuff I'll say to you at a dinner party at the pub, kind of thing. So we're going to stay at the panel discussion level, and I'm going to give an example of this case that we call Project Silvers. So we in London, at least, we give them all code names. The Americans don't go for the code names as much, which frustrates me. So Project Silvers was essentially a bank fraud investigation. We were working for a subsidiary of a then Russian bank, and they noticed that one of their trades that their traders had done had gone awry, but it had gone awry to the tune of $200 million. And so the profit they thought they'd get from this trade was missing $200 million essentially. And what had happened is a group of traders that they'd recently hired from a pipeline trader, so there was a Russian bank trying to establish a presence in the London market. So they'd sort of like almost like Premier League footballers, they'd hired in the best fixed income trading team. And this fixed income trading team had perpetrated a fraud against the bank, where essentially they got the bank to buy some bonds, let's just call them bonds, government bonds, for 4 times what they were really worth. And that difference had then filtered its way back through the Swiss banking system and then the global financial system, and they'd laundered it all around the world. There was a nice mix of characters involved. There's George, who was the sort of big ringleader. Then there was sort of this other character called Vladimir, and he was sort of he'd been laundered to the British public school system. He was sort of, I think, Georgian, but he sounded like a British public school boy, and he was very smooth. And they just, they stole essentially $150 million and then tried to launder it all around the world. And our job was to first investigate the fraud and then find out where they'd hidden the money. And that was working alongside a law firm to trace the funds. So you get disclosure from banks and you gather intelligence externally and you put people under surveillance and you bring this all together. And essentially we brought this case together along with the lawyers, and we went to the High Court and we won, and they recovered a lot of the money, and a lot of the people then subsequently went to a criminal trial. And I think, I hope for them that they're out of prison now, but they were certainly in prison, a few of them for a fair bit, both in the UK and Switzerland. And it was just like this crazy case that involved gathering information from all over the world, fast-paced, high stakes, working closely with lawyers. And yeah, that was one of the cases that I worked on for a couple of years. And it got me totally addicted to the industry. And maybe I'm slightly chasing the dragon of that case ever since, but that's my favorite case. And I can talk about it because it's all public.
Thanks very much, James. So they're the 2 questions for James and Sophia. And now I've got Isma, a couple for you, and then I've got one for Sarah as well. So Isma, you've been asked, first of all, apparently your work sounds fascinating. I'm also interested in terrorism and violent extremism. So I was wondering, to the extent that you focused on these areas during your degree, e.g. for your dissertation, and if so, how do you draw on that in your profession? There's also a second part of a question I'm going to ask you as well, but I'll give you that one first.
Okay, so first of all, thank you. Well, there are different ways I knew I was fascinated by terrorism and violent extremism from the beginning, from my bachelor actually. I studied communication sciences in Italy for my bachelor, but I graduated with a thesis on the communication and propaganda strategies of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So since that moment, I already started understanding that was really drawing my interest. And then when I arrived at LSE, one thing that I really like about LSE Masters is that they allow you to mix and match. You can choose courses that you like even outside of your department. So I think that was really the perfect match for me, because in my master's in comparative politics, I was able to fit modules on counterterrorism, political violence, on post-conflict reconstruction, different things that in the end made sense together for my career. And also my dissertation at the LSE was not specifically on terrorism, but I focused on civil war Syria and on the use of political violence, rape as a war violence, terrorism, starvation as war tactics. So there was also a little bit of that in my dissertation. And I think the dissertation at the LSE and both in my bachelor was the thing that got me into my first internship at the UN Counterterrorism Office, because I had no job experience then. It was really my first interview, my first job interview ever. And I knew I had no experience, but then after knowing that I had taken these courses and that I had wrote 2 dissertations related to terrorism, they were willing to take me on board, even if I was really a fresh graduate.
Perfect. And I said there was a second question that's also come in. I'm just going to ask part of it because it's quite a long question. But for someone who wants to get specifically into your organization now, but their country doesn't currently fund the program that you're on, for example, would you say that a good route in could be internships, working at an NGO later, then applying to more senior roles? Is it possible to go down that route?
Well, I have to say that's something that I personally find a bit problematic, in the sense that the majority of people that I know working for international organizations started as interns in their early years, just after graduation, like I did. But the thing is, 80% of these internships are unpaid. When I was in New York City for the UN, I was unpaid. When I was at the OSCE in Kosovo, I was unpaid. So that's a recurrent problem. There is only the European Union that pays internships through their schemes, but they're of course more competitive. And for programs like the one I am in, your country needs to be interested in spending money on that program. And also they're not programs for recent graduates, like let's say it's people that have like 3-4 years of experiences already. So one way would be to do your internships if you can. I know the UN is starting to pay their interns. There are more and more initiatives to push them towards this, which I think is the right direction, to pay their interns. And another thing you could do is, of course, work for the private sector or NGOs. I know people who have been working for that and joined international organization at a more senior level.
Thanks, Isma. I've got a couple of questions for Sarah. So I'm going to give you this question first of all. So I think you talked again a bit in your introduction about this, but if you're already sort of going in one particular career direction, maybe have some existing experience in a different field, how easily do you think individuals could transfer from one field into your field? So is it always going to be through internships, or would you say, you talked a bit about these sort of transferable skills earlier on, and to what extent maybe people who've moved into your sector from other areas, like what's been kind of their sort of particularly valuable skill set, would you say?
Yeah, sure. So no, definitely, I think the skill sets are transferable. I think when you look at the job descriptions for roles, I mean, there is usually obviously an academic requirement in terms of often people asking for masters, but when it comes to experience, it's normally, you know, X number of years depending on the role and then it will probably state a sort of range of fields or equivalent, and then it's essentially up to you to make the case. So people have come into my charity, for example, from law, but international law backgrounds. They've come in from serving in the police force. Health experts have come in and they were actually previously nurses before. Project managers have worked in sort of the private sector and then have moved across into the public sector. So there is transferable skills. I think this is the thing about, you have to, obviously it's about writing a good cover letter that addresses the job description and that kind of says, you know, I can transfer and I can show you that I can add value. And this is why I want to work for this organization, because, you know, and actually making it personal because you've actually looked into the charity and you agree with what it's trying to do. And then making that case. So yeah, definitely transferable. But I mean, as is the case, you know, a lot of people do transfer within the NGO sector. And so it is also sometimes once you're in the door with one NGO, it makes it a lot easier to go to other NGOs. And it's harder sometimes to make that initial entry level. But once you're in sort of maybe a bit further down in your career and have cultivated, like, for example, particular technical skill set, then you can probably make the case if you find a job that transfers, for sure.
Perfect. And the second part of the question that was asked was just generally, what's your work-life balance like in the sort of work that you do?
Oh, good question. So I think, again, this kind of depends on the role. For me, I've had the benefit and quite unique sort of thing of having a base here and yet being able to travel a lot before COVID to our field operations and being able to, I guess, see and engage with our project staff and yet come back and have essentially my support base here and therefore have reasonably good work-life balance. But for my colleagues I know who work out in our programs, yeah, a lot of them are doing it away from family. They're not family postings. They are very long hours working in very challenging and situations that can be quite insecure. And so that's kind of the extreme, like, front line. But then NGOs have a variety of the supporting roles, your roles that might be based like here in the UK or the US or Australia, Canada. And so I think it kind of then depends on what it is. And sometimes people often say with these roles, it kind of depends, I guess, on, you've got sort of different pots of resilience that you need to have and kind of figuring out where your comfort levels are. Because there are certain things that if people will go over the one particular area, then that's not going to be good for them. And so I guess it's up to these different individuals to find out where that line is. And so you can't really kind of say your work-life balance has to be here, because yeah, it's quite intense when you're working in the field, and so it's not for everyone. But I think yeah, so it really depends on the charity as well and the level of intensity of the jobs. There are times when, you know, and also kind of like I work for an international charity where we're working with countries across the globe, so the calls end up being all hours of the day, just because you're a global organization. So you also factor things like that in with sort of balancing things out. So you need a good line manager essentially to keep you in check and make sure you take your leave. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. John, you've got a question.
I have, thanks, Barnaby. Yeah, I've got a question here which was put forward by Joseph, which I might reframe slightly. So I might put this to Sophia to start with, but I'd actually be quite keen to get everyone's kind of opinions and thoughts on this one. The question was around personal connections, which James, you kind of touched on at the start when you spoke about your father kind of recommending Kroll. So the question was, what is the role in sort of personal connections in your careers? But I thought it might be worth just expanding that slightly and sort of saying, yeah, how important are personal connections, but how can students build those professional networks if they don't have like existing connections already? So Sophia, can maybe start with you?
Of course. Yeah, I mean, I guess like my advice would be, and I mean, this is kind of my mantra for life, is just like, don't hold back with speaking to people, with asking to go for coffees with friends of friends of friends, or people that you saw on a panel, or adding people on LinkedIn. Like, chances are, and like I'm definitely guilty of this, like people love to be asked to sort of give their spiel on their career. Yeah, people love it. It makes you feel like you're a real sort of professional, makes you feel good. Like, it's a nice thing to do. Like, I know for sure, like even off the back of the being on this panel last year, that I had loads of conversations with really interesting like LSE grads who just wanted to kind of have a conversation, hear me give my sort of 10 cents on the sector and why I love it. And that can kind of give you a real leg up. And plenty of people I've then introduced to other people, or I've pointed them in the right direction if I felt like perhaps I wasn't the best placed person. But I just think just having open lines of communication is never a bad thing, would be mine.
Great. And Isma, did you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I agree with Sophia. I mean, I was the first one to do networking in the weirdest way, I would say, when I was a graduate. Like, I remember actually spotting someone who was at the UN in New York through Instagram, which is not a place where you expect to spot someone for connecting for a job, you know. And then I reached out, I was like, do you work for the UN? And then a friendship started, you know, and she's now a UN professional. I'm at the OEC, and that's the ways you establish also your network. And then, of course, when you start doing your internships and your entry-level jobs, your colleagues also start knowing you. And for instance, it can happen that you get recommended for a job because you were an intern in the same organization. This is what happened to me with the OEC. For instance, my colleagues in Kosovo were very happy with my work, and they really recommended the Secretariat to hire me for this entry-level position. And as Sophia said, it's also good to reach out to people on LinkedIn. I mean, the majority of the time, people are happy to explain what they're doing, to give their 10 cents, and to just get to talk to you. So reach out to people on LinkedIn now. That's all we can do. No coffees, no meetings. But in any case, it's still nice. Every week I have someone who reaches out to me and I give them just my WhatsApp. We're just gonna have a call or a Zoom. And it's nice because we've all been in that position when we were graduates and we didn't know exactly where we were going. So we know we are in the shoes of the person who's asking. So, I mean, we are happy to. I think that would be my advice. Just reach out. Everyone has been a recent graduate, so they will be happy to help.
Yeah, I think the sort of online world that we're currently living in possibly might make those catch-ups a bit easier. I'm not sure. But James, yeah, you sort of spoke about your kind of your dad kind of pointing you in the direction of your company.
And I speak about that to be totally honest. I think it's important that sometimes people sort of go, oh, and it was all my own hard work, and I'm such a wonderfully hard-working person. It wasn't. I mean, I was very lucky to have something like that pointed in my direction. You know, then I took it on, fine, but I'm obviously very lucky. And I think one of the ways of bridging that gap, you know, not sure everyone would want my dad to be their father. He's great, but he's not perfect. And so, but it was useful at that time. So, you know, it's, if you don't have my dad, then what you do is you do exactly what you're all doing. You do things that I didn't do at university. You attend things like this, and you reach out on LinkedIn, as everyone has said. I have had several conversations with people. I don't want to be bombarded, but maybe, you know, who cares? I've had people have already added me today. Perfect. That's all we can do. I'm sure some of you will have chats. One thing, so that's what we do. That's how we bridge the gap. People like us need to make ourselves available. The four of us are all doing that. I think more people should be doing it as well. But, you know, and on your side, you just go and have those conversations, go and chat, and try and bridge that gap where connections are important, but they're not the be all and end all. And I think they can be overcome a little bit by your own initiative. And I've had lots of people do that. And they now work at Kroll, a lot of them. There's like 3 or 4 people who studied at LSE, now working in our London office, who I met or other people have met over the time. And they had no pre-existing connection with Kroll other than coming to one of these events. So they work. One question I've seen flying by that I just want to head on, just hit really quickly, about visas and about, you know, international recruitment. I can't speak for every firm, but the bigger the firm is, the more likely that is all I would say. And with Kroll, it certainly has happened where we've sponsored people's visas, Europeans and non-Europeans. So I have a German wife, so I'm very much in favour of international recruitment, and even at entry levels, it has happened before. I'll be honest, you sometimes have to make it more of a case than if they were just someone who could have the automatic right to work. But I want to put that on the table that Kroll, certainly as an organisation, recruits internationally and has done for many years, and hopefully will continue to do so.
Great, thanks for that, James. And yeah, sort of doing mine and Barnaby's job for us there in tackling some of the questions, which is always good. So, Sarah, did you have any sort of final thoughts? I mean, it sounds like all the speakers and panelists are quite keen to connect with students where possible and sort of feasible. But did you have any kind of thoughts on the whole kind of building a professional network point?
Absolutely. I would just echo what others have said, like connect over LinkedIn, and literally just reach out, because we've made ourselves available here, but equally it's then, if you connect with us, we can then potentially see if we can connect you with others, and that's the connections that give you the connections. And again, that comes back to the thing of what you're interested in, because when I've had different students that have come to me, I'm particularly interested in climate change or something. I'm not, okay, that's not my area, but I'm pretty sure we can find, somebody. And so I think it's often then that kind of sort of domino effect that we can hopefully do. So even if we're not the right people, hopefully we might be able to even find and point you in the direction of who are the right people. And then I think it's just that you're then front of mind. The more that you make yourself known, if something comes up with us and we're thinking, oh, what about that? Oh, well, I remember so took the initiative and reached out and was actually genuinely interested in what we were doing and wanted to chat. That sticks out a mile. So that will land you in good stead, I think, potentially, especially when it comes to interviews, if you've got those connections, for sure.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Barnaby for the next question.
I've got one for you next. So you've been asked, has technology, particularly artificial intelligence, impacted your field of expertise? And what are some in-demand, if any, technical skills required for the sort of analysis that you do?
Great question. The first thing I'll say is artificial intelligence doesn't, in my view, yet exist. But what we do have is machine learning and various forms of that kind of stuff that we use. I mean, I don't think we're quite there with artificial intelligence, but it's certainly people are throwing the words around. So that's my first point. But yes, we're absolutely using it. We use it for different kinds of things. We use it to aid our investigations. We have a particular tool that we use that sort of makes suggestions to the investigator as they're going along. So, you'll pull my LinkedIn profile and then it will pull out the companies I've worked for. Then it will suggest another thing, but then it will go, oh, by the way, you've already looked at another subject who also worked for Kroll. And then it will suggest a connection. So we're seeing stuff like that happening. We're also seeing tools where you're, one of the things we look at quite a lot increasingly is we look at social media risk. So we're looking at what people say on social media. We have a couple of clients where we review, saying they're about to hire someone or about to partner with someone. We'll review the social media looking for problematic content or content that could cause a controversy or has caused a controversy. And in order to do that quickly, we use a bit of machine learning, a bit of image recognition, all on the public content of these people, but it's still a little bit. So in terms of skills, I would say that I like to see humanities graduates who can use an iPhone. That's kind of my sweet spot. I mean, that it's like a glib thing to say, but I don't want someone who's built their personality around not liking computers and just liking books. I like someone who's sort of able to balance both. I like someone who's comfortable with a spreadsheet. Some of the basic stuff doesn't have to be a pro at it, but someone who's perhaps dabbled with a little bit of coding. You don't have to be a coder either, but it's like it shows someone that's sort of thinking about things. Someone who can switch the television on for their parents is the one that is the child that the parents will go to first when they can't get the TV to work. I want someone who can fix the computer when it's being annoying. That's important to us increasingly because we're using so many tools and we need people who are adaptable to use these new tools as they come online. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. You got a plug in there for your former employer, Apple, as well. So Isma, this one is for you, and then the final individual question, Sophia, I got afterwards. Isma, you've been asked, will public sector or police experience within regional governments increase the chances of entering into international organizations? So perhaps maybe if the answer to that question is no, what sort of sectors and experience might be useful in your opinion?
Okay, so that's a very good question. I would say it depends on the organization because, for instance, the OSCE, the organization I work for at the moment, they hire quite a lot of people with a police law enforcement background, especially in the field missions. I remember when I was in Kosovo, I was one of the few ones in the department who didn't have a police background. So they work with police development, security sector reform. So what the OSCE does is really specific, especially in their first strategic dimension, which is political military. So they seek people that have this kind of expertise. For other organizations, it really depends. For the United Nations, I've seen like usually UN diplomats don't have this specific police experience or experience with the institutions of their government, but they're more like generalists, let's say. So it really depends on the role that you go after and on the organization. Well, that's something that I would highlight. Check the requirements, and different organizations also place importance on different standards and different work backgrounds.
Thank you very much. And Sophia, the question for you actually relates to something you said right back at the beginning, relating to your math skills.
Oh.
So in terms of quantitative skills in your sector, now clearly there are some roles where these are more required, but I guess to what extent would someone need to work on the kind of quant skills, and kind of what sort of information do you need to understand that's numerical in the sort of line of work that you do and perhaps your colleagues do as well?
I think that I'm living proof that it's possible to do it without any mathematical aptitude whatsoever. Having said that, I do think that whilst in my experience at least, you're never really required to do like any sort of quantitative analysis. Sometimes maybe you're working with external consultants who are sort of providing that more technical aspect. I think that it's always helpful, I guess, to have a grasp of finance. I think that, bear in mind that probably you're looking at quite a lot of financial reports and things like that. So, as long as that's not sort of like total hieroglyphics to you, I think you should be fine. But I also think that that's very much something that you can learn on the job. I don't think anybody would be expecting you to sort of come in to an entry-level job and be a sort of super whiz financial analyst or mathematician. I mean, good stuff if you are, but not required, I'd say.
Perfect, thank you very much. So John, you're coming in with a question, I think.
I am, yes. So I've got a question which I think is quite probably quite a common one for students and graduates kind of looking to apply and get into certain sectors, and it's about sort of how to frame experiences that you've had before. So the question's from Tatiana, and it was how did you frame your previous experiences before your interviews in order to make them appealing to your organisation? So maybe I can start with Isma on this one. I suppose it's about how to articulate the previous experiences you've had and make them appealing to the organisation you're applying to.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was graduating and I had no job experience, the only thing I could rely on was my studies, my thesis, my extracurricular activities. And if you're applying for internships and you really have an interest in an area and you've done activity on that, you wrote a thesis on that, that really should be enough to get your first internship. And going a little bit further in my career, I noticed that what's important is to frame in the right way two things: your transferable skills, like in my case, it's like project management analysis, or I mean, you can find a lot of things that you learn even through internships of the previous jobs that are really transferable. And the second thing is to highlight and to frame in the right way what makes you special. Like there are lots of candidates applying to a lot of positions. So if you have transferable skills and also something that is really relevant and specific to you, it can be regional expertise in something, it can be that you worked on a project that is related to the organization you're applying to, or something like this. So find something that is very general and very transferable and something very specific. I think the way to frame a good application is towards just two lines, in my view.
Great, thank you. And maybe I can move on to Sophia and see if you had any kind of thoughts on maybe kind of previous experiences you've had, articulating your experiences when you've been applying to and interviewing for jobs.
Yeah, I think that echoing what Isma said, transferable skills are really key. So soft skills, like any job that you do, or most jobs that you do, I'd say you're developing some kind of skill. Like even if you're working in a cafe or in a restaurant, if you're interacting with clients all the time, even the fact, as James was saying, like turning up on time, making sure that, you know, whatever it is that you're doing it well and kind of wholeheartedly. I think that can be a really strong case, even if you don't, you know, necessarily have the luxury in that instance of having something which is very specific to the job. I also think, and I mean, this is something that I certainly, you know, have sort of used myself, is I think that sometimes having a willingness to recognize the fact that you don't have necessarily all the skills already there and ready to go, and maybe you don't have the perfect CV, but saying, look, what I lack in X, Y, and Z, I'm going to make up for in like absolute bucket loads of gumption, and I'm going to be early every day, and I'm going to be a joy to work with, and etc., etc. So I think just, yeah, being able to identify and sort of talk about those soft skills that are transferable and that you can kind of apply to a different scenario, and also, you know, recognizing the areas where perhaps you don't have like 10 out of 10 marks, as it were, and being able to kind of supplement that by saying, but look, I've got this and this to offer.
Yeah, thank you. And James, sorry to sort of refer to something that you said earlier on about working for Apple, and then you sort of said that, you know, there were skills that you learnt there that were then useful.
Yeah.
In any thoughts on kind of how to articulate those skills that you've had previously?
Yeah, well, you need to think about try to imagine what the job you're going into is. You're not always going to be able to do it because it's not always going to be obvious from the outside. And you should forgive yourself for not always knowing exactly what the job would be like, but, you know, that's why conversation people, but then sort of go, okay, so at the Apple store, I occasionally had to stand in front of customers and present on the new iPad. I used to stand, not an iPad, but I used to stand there with the iPad, and I used to say, right, you know, here's the new iPad, this is what the new iPad does. And I have to do that in front of 100 people just walking in and out, asking me questions. And I could then make an argument that experience taught me how to present. So that's how you do it. You sort of go, okay, this thing that existed in my previous job or the other experience I had, this is how I can connect it to how I would imagine job is. But I think we've covered, I think everyone else has said very similar things, but that's what I would do. And I can't speak for every employer, but I really do value these sort of shop level, restaurant level, those kind of experiences you would have had as students when you're younger. I think they're really, really important. And if you haven't got it, maybe that's the thing you should add to your CV more than anything else. I can't speak for every other employer, but I certainly think it's something I definitely look for in all of the candidates I'm looking at. It doesn't mean you don't have restaurant experience, I'm not going to hire you, but it's just a sign that you've had a different kind of experience. It's not all just being one type of experience. I think that helps.
I think that's a really good point, and sometimes people will take those experiences off their CV, and
they shouldn't.
No, I agree.
Especially at entry level.
Yeah. So did you have any sort of final points on this question?
No, I think just echoing, I mean, a lot of what the other speakers have said. I mean, a lot of the interviews and the ways that the jobs are now written in my sector are very much competency based, skill set based. You know, give us an example of when you did problem solving, or when you had to deal with, you know, coordinating or communicating or working cross culturally. And so it's kind of comes down to, like, it doesn't matter, you know, the specific example, but it's more, did you have that particular skill set, and can you translate it in terms of to show that you have that particular skill, and therefore you could bring it into the sector. So I think no, that's definitely, I think, the way that a lot of the sectors are going. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to worry about time, but I'm going to hand over to Barnaby for what I think is the final question.
Yeah, very much will be the last question. So just a nice wrap-up question. Just to the students in the audience, John's also going to pop a reflection form in the chat for you if you want to fill out your thoughts on today's event. That'd be really helpful. So the last question I'm going to ask, and we often ask it at the end of this, and someone did actually put this in before the event even started today, which was, I'm going to paraphrase it, but given the time constraints, if you'd like to give us just one final piece of advice that if you were sitting in the audience now, that you think you would find useful to have known, if you were sort of still in the same position as many of the students today. I'm going to go first of all to Isma, I think, on this one.
Yeah, I think if I could say something to myself like 5 or 6 years ago, would be to not give up, to keep applying. Everyone is trying to portray their experience like they got the job, they did this, and sometimes when you're in graduate school, people are trying to mislead you into thinking that it was really easy for them to get that job or to get that internship. It's not like that. Everyone is going through hard time. Everyone is applying to hundreds of positions. So don't feel like you're not on track and that other people got something more than you, or got it more, or they got it more easily. So just keep going. And yeah, maybe the last application you do is going to be the right one, but resilience, keep applying and keep going.
Thank you very much. James, would you like to come in next?
One thing that I would say to people, and this is not something that I've seen, but I've seen with a lot of my friends, is they, you know, if it's not working, leave. If you don't enjoy it, move on to something else, your first job. But if you are enjoying it, don't always chase the 5K pay bump. This is more a private sector thing, right? I see it with a lot of young people. They go, "Oh, I'm going to go over there. I'm going to earn 5 more K." Well, that's great, and that's really important in life to make sure you're getting paid what you think you're worth. But at the same time, don't ignore the benefit of staying in a place where you're enjoying it. Because if you're enjoying it and people are enjoying your work, then other rewards can come. So 1, move if it's really miserable. Don't waste your life on something miserable. But 2, don't always be looking over your shoulder for something else if you're actually enjoying yourself.
Brilliant, valuable advice. I think next we'll go to Sarah.
I guess my advice would be just around use your time that you've got wisely. So, I mean, in terms of, yes, definitely in terms of like being persistent, but as in like, particularly when you're studying and have, you know, in terms of the time, in terms of your extracurricular activities and your holidays and, you know, the things that you're interested in, use that, I think, in terms of experience and skill sets. And, you know, people talk about the kind of all the different kind of jobs that you could then draw on later, whatever they happen to be. But use your time wisely, because that will just set you up in good stead for then when you start to go into the whatever sector it is.
Thank you very much. And Sophia, would you like to do the honours of wrapping up with the final response?
Sure. I guess sort of my advice would be, and again, sort of just thinking of myself in that position, would be that I think this is true of sort of early stage of your career, but also to an extent like throughout your career. Sort of everyone's basically making it up as they go along. You know, there's no, you don't ever come into a job with a perfect set of skills. You don't ever reach a point, I don't think necessarily, where you feel like, oh, I've got it all figured out. Like, it's always a process, it's always a learning curve. I think just don't be afraid to ask questions and put yourself out there. I spent so much of my sort of first few years of working being terrified of sounding like an idiot. And I just think it's a waste of time. You've got so much more to learn and take so much more enjoyment about taking a sort of more open approach.
Thank you very much. So it seems that the younger versions of all of yourselves have been well informed with those last bits of advice. We've overrun slightly, so apologies for that. But thank you very much to our entire panel. So as I said, 4 alumni, 3 countries, 2 continents isn't bad for a Wednesday. Hopefully you've enjoyed the event. Thank you very much for staying throughout if you're still here, which a lot of you are. It's great to see. We wouldn't have all fitted into the lecture theatre that we had last year at the very beginning, so that's great. Thank you again to all the panelists. Please accept the virtual gratitudes that are now coming your way in the chat function. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your evenings, of course, and your day if you're in the US, like one of you is. I really appreciate your time and all your insights. And yeah, thank you so much for it once again, and take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, everyone.